Monday mornings had always been predictable for him. For 17 years, he arrived before the cleaners, walked the production floor, greeted employees by name, and reviewed the numbers that defined the company's pulse. But that morning felt oddly foreign. Security guards he had known for years avoided eye contact. The receptionist spoke in short sentences, her smile forced. The elevator ride, usually filled with nods and casual greetings, became a silent ascent into unfamiliar tension. He smelled change before he saw it, and it unsettled something deep in his chest. When the elevator doors opened on the executive floor, he noticed the brass nameplates outside offices had been replaced overnight. His portrait, which once hung proudly between the founders and industry pioneers, was gone. In its place, a sleek digital screen displayed motivational quotes he never approved. He walked toward the boardroom, convinced there had been a misunderstanding, only to be met with a scene he never imagined. Faces he didn't recognize sat around the table, dressed in expensive suits that still bore the stiffness of recent tailoring. Some whispered, others stared at him as if he were a trespasser. At the head of the table sat his wife's younger brother, a man whose resume consisted of loud opinions, impulsive investments, and a college degree financed by the very company he now attempted to command. He lounged confidently in the CEO's chair, fingers drumming the polished surface as if this kingdom had always belonged to him. The smugness in his posture was not simply disrespect, it was ownership claimed without earning. There was no handshake, no welcome speech, not even a nod acknowledging the years poured into this business. Instead, the brother-in-law pushed a document across the table with a rehearsed flick of his wrist. The gesture carried the casual arrogance of someone delivering a parking ticket. "Your services are no longer required here," he announced, his voice sharp enough to slice the room in half. Around him, several board members hid their discomfort behind screens and scribbles. A young intern raised a smartphone, pretending to check messages, but clearly recording. Cameras flashed as if history were being rewritten in real time. He picked up the paper, scanning it slowly. It accused him of outdated leadership, resistance to change, and misalignment with the company's future vision. Not once did it mention the patents he filed, the contracts he negotiated, or the sleepless nights that kept the company alive through recessions, market crashes, and a pandemic. It was a dismissal designed to humiliate, crafted by people who valued titles over legacy and noise over wisdom. HR entered with military precision, 2 representatives carrying termination folders and scripted sympathy. They requested his badge, phone, and access card with the tone of gatekeepers evicting an intruder. Employees watched from glass partitions as the man who once solved their crises was escorted down the same hallway he had designed on blueprints. Some looked away, afraid to be associated with loyalty in a company suddenly allergic to history. Others whispered rumors, eager to stay aligned with the rising sun, even if it burned everything in its path. He stepped outside, the cold air greeting him like an old friend. For the first time in years, he wasn't rushing to a meeting or a deadline. He stood motionless, absorbing the betrayal. They believed they had ended his chapter. They forgot he was the one who owned the library. No one in that room, not the board, not the HR agents, and certainly not his brother-in-law, knew the silent clause that protected him. While they celebrated their coup, he held 82% ownership. They fired a man they didn't understand. They evicted a king from a castle he built, unaware he still owned every brick. And when a man owns the floor, he decides exactly when the ceiling collapses. He walked out of the building with the slow, deliberate steps of a man who understood a truth no one else seemed to grasp. Storms don't announce themselves with thunder. They begin quietly, with air pressure changing in places no one sees. He didn't demand explanations, didn't plead his case, and didn't bother reminding them of his contributions. Silence, in the hands of the wise, becomes sharper than any accusation. While others fight battles with shouts, he preferred weapons forged in patience. As the glass doors closed behind him, the boardroom erupted in applause. His brother-in-law raised a champagne glass, offering a toast to the new era, unaware that eras require architects, not amateurs with inflated egos. The employees forced smiles, the kind worn by people who are not convinced, but terrified of being the next target. The HR manager wiped sweat from his forehead, relieved the ordeal was over, never realizing that the ordeal had not even begun. Outside, he stood still for a moment, absorbing the scene around him. Delivery trucks moved in and out of the loading bay, unaware that the signature required for their next shipment rested with the man they had just dismissed. A group of engineers discussed upcoming projects, not yet informed that the only person who understood the maintenance cycles and safety protocols no longer had access to the building. He watched these details with the calm detachment of someone reviewing a house before a controlled demolition. He wasn't angry. He was calculating. He walked to his car, opened the door, and sat in silence. His phone buzzed with messages from colleagues confused by the news. Some begged him to fight back. Others offered condolences as though someone had died. But he knew the truth: no one had died. Something had just been born. Sometimes the most dangerous plans come wrapped in quiet breaths and measured heartbeats. Driving away, he recalled every supplier contact, every handshake deal, every undocumented agreement that kept the company running behind closed doors. The brother-in-law believed leadership lived in titles and office chairs. He didn't understand that companies breathe through relationships forged over years of shared risks, late-night negotiations, and favors earned through competence. Without those arteries, the corporation was a body without circulation. Its heart might beat, but its limbs would fail. Back at home, he brewed coffee, opened his laptop, and began reviewing documents the board had never seen. Ownership clauses, emergency voting rights, and intellectual property agreements sat neatly in his archives. They saw him as obsolete, unaware that he held the keys to the infrastructure they treated as decoration. They replaced the captain but forgot that he owned the shipyard. His silence wasn't resignation. It was observation. He watched his brother-in-law's social media announcement later that evening, a staged photograph in the CEO's chair, captioned with phrases like new leadership, innovation, and visionary changes. Comments poured in from people who had never lifted a finger for the company, but suddenly claimed allegiance. The brother-in-law reposted articles praising his rise, mistaking noise for respect. He believed he had conquered something. In reality, he had inherited a machine he didn't know how to operate. The silence deepened the next morning when suppliers called, asking for approvals no one could provide. The finance department waited for passwords that didn't exist outside the founder's head. Contracts paused. Deadlines slipped. No one dared mention his name, fearing it might summon accountability. Yet his absence echoed louder than his presence ever had. He didn't lift a finger. He didn't need to. Systems built on experience don't collapse with speeches. They collapse when the person holding them together quietly walks away. His silence wasn't weakness. It was the fuse. And while everyone in that boardroom celebrated the spark, none of them realized he was the one who controlled the explosion. The evening air felt heavier than usual when he walked into the house. In other times, that doorway had represented rest after long days spent negotiating contracts, managing crises, and building a company brick by brick. But tonight, the silence inside felt confrontational. His wife sat at the dining table, not with sympathy, but with an expression rehearsed in the mirror, one that blended disappointment with condescension. She didn't rise to greet him. She didn't ask how he was. She folded her arms and prepared her verdict. He expected questions or perhaps a moment of concern. Instead, she launched into a speech about progress, claiming that her brother was bringing the company into the future. She spoke as though she were an expert on strategy and innovation, though her closest involvement with the business had been attending company galas and posing for photographs. Her tone carried an unsettling certainty, the kind that only appears in people who have never faced consequences. He listened quietly, absorbing her every word. She didn't mention his sacrifices, the years without vacations, the nights spent awake during recessions, or the way he had mortgaged everything to save the firm during its early years. Instead, she accused him of being stuck in the past, insisting that he didn't understand how younger leadership operated. She repeated phrases she had clearly memorized from someone else, mistaking slogans for wisdom. When he tried to explain the implications of what had happened, she dismissed him with a wave of her hand. She was intoxicated by her brother's sudden rise. In her mind, titles were crowns, and the one who wore them held the kingdom. She assumed success was a family trait, not a skill acquired through sleepless nights and difficult decisions. She believed her brother's power was secure, as if arrogance could be welded into permanence. Later that night, he walked past their bedroom and found an open suitcase on the bed. Her clothes were neatly folded, jewelry boxes stacked, and travel bags arranged as if she were preparing for a long-awaited vacation. She did not hide her intentions. She said she needed to be with people who were going somewhere, implying that he, without his office, had become a dead weight. She spoke with the certainty of a gambler who believed she had bet on the house, not realizing she was betting her entire future on a novice with a borrowed throne. As she packed, he sat in silence. He didn't ask her to stay. He didn't accuse. He didn't plead. He had learned long ago that a person who abandons you during a storm is incapable of standing with you in sunlight. She mistook his calm for defeat, not realizing that still water often hides depth, and depth can drown the careless. When she finally closed the suitcase, she paused at the door, expecting him to regret losing her. But regret requires admiration, and admiration requires loyalty. She had shown neither. She left the house confident that she had chosen the winning side. She believed power lived in offices and job titles. She didn't understand that ownership isn't emotional. It's contractual. Titles can be revoked, chairs can be emptied, and offices can be reassigned. Ownership survives without applause. As he watched her car leave the driveway, a strange peace settled over him. The house was quiet, but the silence was no longer sharp. It was clarifying. The people who walked away had revealed their worth. The people worth keeping remained. He didn't lose a wife, he lost a spectator. And spectators don't build empires. She assumed her brother's victory was permanent because she had never witnessed real power. Power isn't loud. It doesn't pose for photos. It signs, it waits, and it acts when the moment is correct. She left believing the story was finished. She never realized she had exited before the plot began. The first week after his departure looked normal on the surface. Machines hummed, employees clocked in, and memos circulated with confident language drafted by the new leadership. But beneath that thin layer of routine, cracks had already begun to form. The production floor supervisor noticed delays in configuring the automated lines, delays that previously never occurred. The IT team sent repeated requests for access codes, not understanding that the only person who possessed them had been escorted out without a handshake. The company had mistaken the man who built the engine for a removable part, forgetting engines don't run themselves. By the second week, suppliers who once extended credit purely because of his reputation began asking questions. They requested confirmations, signatures, and guarantees. Relationships he had cultivated over dinners, conferences, and last-minute favors suddenly evaporated. The brother-in-law CEO attempted to bluff his way through, offering confident smiles and empty promises. He didn't realize that business isn't built on enthusiasm, it's built on trust. And trust cannot be forged overnight by someone whose greatest achievement was inheriting authority rather than earning it. Without approved signatures, raw materials remained stranded in warehouses. Trucks scheduled to deliver vital components sat idle because no one was authorized to sign procurement releases. Production managers watched helplessly as deadlines slipped, contracts went unfulfilled, and penalties accumulated. Yet the board remained convinced this was a temporary setback. They labeled it an adjustment period, mistaking a hemorrhage for a paper cut. By the fourth week, systems he designed without fanfare began failing. Maintenance logs he alone understood remained unread. He had built the machinery like a conductor writes music, each component tuned to respond to his instructions. The new CEO, believing software and hardware were interchangeable with ambition, tried to override protocols. His attempts corrupted files, disrupted calibration cycles, and triggered safety shutdowns. Machines halted mid-process, producing defective batches that cost millions to scrap. Employees no longer whispered, they talked openly in hallways and parking lots. Veteran technicians shook their heads, muttering that leadership had replaced the brain with a billboard. Engineers updated resumes, sensing the ship had lost its captain. Middle managers, once confident under his direction, now floated through their days waiting for instructions that never came. They had traded stability for speeches and lost both. Investors requested emergency reports. They noticed quarterly projections shrinking, dividends evaporating, and customer complaints multiplying. The company hotline rang nonstop with clients asking why their orders were delayed. Some threatened legal action. Others terminated contracts altogether. The brand that once stood for reliability now became synonymous with confusion. The new CEO didn't acknowledge the crisis. Instead, he blamed the economy. He blamed fuel costs. He even blamed employees for lacking initiative. He gave press interviews boasting about a new strategic direction, unaware that direction means nothing when the wheels are no longer attached to the vehicle. He thought leadership was a microphone. He never learned it was a mirror. Meanwhile, the boardroom began to shift. Members who once applauded the takeover now sat in tense silence. Numbers didn't lie, and the spreadsheets were brutal. They couldn't understand how a thriving business had unraveled in less than a month. The answer was simple, yet none dared say it aloud. They had dismissed knowledge while chasing novelty. By the 6th week, panic replaced optimism. Clients defected. Banks requested audits. A rumor circulated through the building that the only person who knew how to restart the company was the man they mocked, escorted out and replaced with a slogan. Employees stopped asking when things would improve. They asked if it was already too late. The company had believed success lived in titles, offices, and conference speeches. Now it faced a painful truth. The building didn't lose an employee. It lost its architect. And buildings without architects don't collapse suddenly, they crumble with embarrassing precision. The quarterly numbers arrived like a verdict, and there was no room for interpretation. The company had not merely underperformed, it had imploded. Revenue streams that once flowed like rivers had dried up. Long-term clients, who for years had accepted delays or minor issues out of loyalty, had terminated their contracts without hesitation. Production output dropped to levels reminiscent of the company's earliest, most fragile days. The spreadsheets that once reflected growth and stability now resembled autopsy reports. The board members stared at the figures in disbelief, hoping their eyes were wrong, yet every line on the screen confirmed their error. Shareholders, once patient and supportive, demanded explanations. Phone lines buzzed with heated accusations. Emails arrived every hour, some questioning leadership, others threatening lawsuits. The chairman of the board, a man who prided himself on avoiding emotional responses, lost his composure during an investor call. He stuttered as he tried to justify the catastrophic performance, his voice cracking when asked why the company's backbone had been removed without a transition plan. Investors wanted answers. They received excuses. Excuses are cheap, and no investor pays for those. By the 3rd week of the financial fallout, the board convened an emergency meeting. The tension in the room was palpable, like dust before a storm. Gone were the confident grins and celebratory toasts that accompanied the new CEO's appointment. Now, board members avoided eye contact, each silently hoping someone else would shoulder the blame. The new CEO presented another slideshow full of buzzwords and vague assurances. He blamed external factors, supply chain disruptions, inflation, global uncertainty. But numbers don't respect narratives, and charts don't apologize for the truth. One board member finally spoke up, her voice steady but sharp. She reminded the room that the company had survived market collapses, industry disruptions, and global crises, not because of luck, but because of leadership. Leadership that had now been removed and replaced with ambition disguised as qualification. The room fell silent. The truth had been spoken, and truth has a habit of exposing masks. Behind closed doors, rumors circulated like wildfire. Employees whispered that the founder had been spotted consulting for rival firms. Suppliers hinted that he held proprietary knowledge they desperately needed. Managers speculated that he alone possessed the codes, the relationships, and the operational memory required to restart the system. What began as quiet murmurs grew into a chorus the board could no longer ignore. The new CEO tried to regain control. He scheduled motivational speeches, printed new corporate mottos, and sent out emails filled with empty enthusiasm. But employees didn't need cheerleaders, they needed guidance. Machines didn't respond to slogans, they responded to expertise. Every attempt he made to look decisive only amplified his incompetence. The board started receiving resignation letters from long-serving employees who could not, in good conscience, remain aboard a sinking vessel. By the end of the month, the board held another emergency session, this time without the CEO present. Legal advisors attended, auditors brought reports, and the company's losses took shape not as numbers, but as consequences. One director opened a folder that held a simple yet damning document, proof of majority ownership still held by the man they had fired. The board members exchanged glances of disbelief and dread. They had not merely dismissed an executive, they had expelled the owner. The chairman leaned back in his chair, the weight of realization pressing his shoulders. The company had gambled on the illusion of innovation and lost everything. Now, there was only one viable path left, a path bruised by pride and paved with regret. Someone finally said the words everyone else feared but secretly hoped to hear. We need him back. The board didn't understand yet, but the storm was no longer approaching. It had already arrived. When he stepped into the building again, there were no cameras waiting, no applause, no forced smiles. The air felt different. It wasn't the entrance of a defeated man seeking validation, it was the calm stride of someone who knew the rules better than the people trying to play him. He didn't bring a resume or a pitch. He arrived with 3 attorneys, a banker, and a briefcase that did not contain hope, but consequences. The board had gathered, expecting negotiations. They assumed he would beg for a lesser role, perhaps a consultant position or an advisory seat. They believed humiliation had softened him. Pride makes fools imaginative. Instead, he walked past their outstretched hands and placed a stack of documents on the table. His voice was quiet, yet it carried the certainty of someone holding a detonator. He began with a sentence that removed the illusions from the room. This meeting isn't about rehiring. It's about correcting the paperwork. One of his attorneys opened the briefcase and distributed folders that contained information none of them had bothered to verify months earlier. Ownership certificates, patent registrations, intellectual property agreements, emergency voting clauses, transfer restrictions, silent provisions that didn't care about opinions or enthusiasm. Legal architecture built over years, invisible to those who only saw titles. The chairman skimmed the files, and his face drained of color. Every signature led back to one truth: the man they fired was not a former employee. He was the majority shareholder, 82% majority, to be precise. The new CEO, the brother-in-law who had celebrated his victory with speeches and champagne, had never read the foundational documents he pretended to control. In a single morning, every assumption the board made turned to dust. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't gloat. He simply invoked a clause that allowed the controlling shareholder to request a vote on executive positions without notice. The board attempted to stall, but legal counsel confirmed the clause was binding. They tried to negotiate, but negotiations require leverage, and they had none left. Numbers speak louder than regret. The vote began. One by one, board members shifted their loyalties. No one wanted to be allied with sinking leadership. The brother-in-law protested, insisting plans were underway and improvements were imminent. His voice trembled, his hands curled into fists, but desperation doesn't substitute for expertise. He had mistaken temporary authority for ownership, forgetting that chairs can rotate. The final vote was recorded. The CEO was removed. Silence fell around the table, not the silence of calm, but of resignation. Decisions made in arrogance were now being undone with signatures. The HR director entered hesitantly, recognizing the shift in power. His expression mirrored the shock of someone witnessing history rewrite itself without warning. He nodded once, and HR understood. The same personnel who escorted him out weeks earlier now approached the brother-in-law. The CEO badge was collected. The office keys were surrendered. Security walked beside him, not out of threat, but protocol. The parade of humiliation had reversed direction. Employees paused as he passed. Their expressions didn't show sympathy. They showed recognition of fate, of order restored, of the price of ego. Outside, the brother-in-law stood in the parking lot, staring at the car he once claimed symbolized success. His sister hadn't returned his messages. His supporters evaporated faster than applause after a losing speech. The building he thought he controlled now belonged fully to the man he betrayed. Inside the boardroom, the majority owner closed his folder. He didn't reclaim his old desk or ask to be CEO again. He didn't need titles. Power requires no announcement. He had returned not to occupy a position, but to demonstrate a principle. You cannot fire the architect and expect the building to remain standing. And that day, everyone finally understood who owned the foundation. Yet, despite the success, he didn't celebrate publicly. He attended no galas, gave no dramatic interviews, and posed for no triumphant photographs. Silence remained his weapon of choice. While others broadcast victories, he fortified them. His story wasn't one of loud retaliation, it was one of quiet permanence. He had proven that power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it signs a document and waits. Meanwhile, the remnants of his former life watched him from afar. His ex-wife observed the headlines, realizing too late that the man she dismissed didn't just survive, he ascended. Her brother struggled to rebuild his reputation, but reputations are not resumes. They cannot be edited once truth has entered the room. People spoke of the downfall not with mockery, but with caution, as though recounting a parable etched into corporate scripture. Inside business circles, his name became a reference point. Consultants cited him. Entrepreneurs quoted him. Executives repeated one of his most defining lessons in boardrooms across the country: never fire the man who owns the building. Not because he might destroy it, but because he can rebuild it without you. His victory wasn't emotional. It wasn't crafted out of bitterness or fueled by pride. He didn't win through shouting or by proving others wrong. He won through the three tools most leaders underestimate: patience, signatures, and silence. The same silence that escorted him out now crowned his return. The same signatures they ignored now governed their future. And patience, quiet and underestimated, outlived every insult. They fired him on day one. He owned them forever. Not by conquering the empire they stole, but by outgrowing it so completely that history could no longer mention their names without mentioning his. The morning after the vote, the house he once shared with his wife felt foreign, not because anything had changed in the furniture or decor, but because the meaning of everything inside it had shifted. The woman who once lectured him about moving forward now sat on the porch, waiting. Her confident posture was gone. In its place stood uncertainty wrapped in regret. She rose as he approached, her eyes searching for something familiar, perhaps the man she assumed would always be waiting for her. But loyalty, once broken, doesn't regenerate on command. She began with apologies. Not heartfelt ones, but the kind crafted when fear replaces conviction. She said she misunderstood, believed her brother's vision, thought he needed support. She called it a mistake. He listened without interrupting, his silence neither hostile nor forgiving, simply factual. To her, betrayal was a momentary error. To him, it was a revelation. She tried to justify her choices, claiming she gambled on security, not greed. She insisted she never meant to hurt him, that she assumed he would survive anything, including abandonment. What she didn't understand was simple: strength doesn't mean tolerance for disrespect. A man can endure storms, but he doesn't invite them into his home. When she realized he remained unmoved, her tone changed. She attempted nostalgia, mentions of their early years, shared dreams, the sacrifices they once made together. But nostalgia can erase decisions made in daylight. He didn't remind her of her words, her suitcase, or the satisfaction she displayed when she believed he had been replaced. Her memory already carried that burden. Meanwhile, the former CEO, her brother, discovered a different kind of reckoning. He had spent his entire adult life believing proximity to success was the same as achievement. Now stripped of title and authority, he walked through the city with the heavy awareness that no one returned his calls. The same friends who toasted his rise had evaporated. His inbox, once overflowing with praise, was filled with silence. He came unannounced to the company gates, hoping to plead his case. Security denied access. He demanded to speak with his brother-in-law, expecting a conversation, a negotiation, a lifeline. Instead, the new guard on duty spoke a simple sentence: "He's unavailable." The words carried a weight the former CEO had never encountered. Not anger, not rejection, indifference. Indifference is the currency of consequences. Days later, he reached out again, this time through intermediaries. He offered apologies, proposals, even unpaid advisory work. He promised loyalty, humility, anything that resembled value. But none of those things mattered. You could not repay a debt with currency you never possessed. Respect isn't retroactive. Back at the house, his wife presented her final attempt, a proposition to start over. She suggested therapy, vacations, even leaving the city. She offered changes without understanding that the contract she violated wasn't marital, it was moral. She had chosen status over substance. And now that the status had collapsed, she came running back to substance, forgetting substance remembers everything. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't insult either of them. His composure made the truth more painful than anger ever could. He simply made a statement that ended every argument before it began: "I don't rebuild where trust chose to leave." People expect revenge to be loud. They imagine scenes filled with shouting and destruction. But revenge isn't always an action. Sometimes it's an absence, the absence of access, of relevance, of return. The former CEO lost his position. His sister lost her place. Both believed money and proximity to power guaranteed permanence. They never realized permanence belongs only to those who respect what sustains it. He had not destroyed them. He didn't have to. He simply executed ownership, and ownership carries a consequence no fortune can erase. You can replace a title. You cannot replace trust. The company's transformation didn't begin with a press release or a grand speech. It began the morning after the vote, when he stepped into the executive floor not as an employee returning to duty, but as the owner reclaiming his foundation. He didn't rearrange furniture or redecorate offices. He replaced policies, restored priorities, and removed the rot disguised as innovation. The machines that once sat idle whirred back to life under his directive, guided not by slogans, but by structure. People who once whispered now worked with renewed conviction. The heartbeat of the company returned, not louder, but steadier, like a veteran breathing again after being pulled from the water. His first move wasn't revenge. It was alignment. He met with department heads privately, reviewing systems they had forgotten how to operate. He reinstated trust not through promises, but through competence. Within days, suppliers re-established credit lines. Contracts reactivated. Deadlines revived. The employees watched in quiet awe as problems that had plagued them for weeks evaporated in hours. Leadership wasn't a performance. It was a skill, and he executed it without theatrics. Word spread quickly beyond the walls of the company. Investors who once doubted the firm now competed to secure meetings with him. They admired what he embodied: stability in an unstable market. While others played at leadership, he demonstrated it. He didn't chase partnerships, he selected them. Global firms reached out, proposing expansions he hadn't even considered. He reviewed each proposal methodically, choosing allies who valued legacy over hype. When the contracts were signed, they weren't just deals, they were declarations. Revenue didn't climb gradually, it multiplied. The company doubled its earnings in less time than analysts thought reasonable. Competitors who once dismissed him scrambled to mimic strategies they didn't understand. Journalists published articles dissecting his decisions, trying to extract formulas from what was, in truth, instinct honed by years of experience. Shareholders who once panicked now celebrated record dividends. The board that fired him now applauded him from the shadows, hoping history would forget their part in his expulsion.